Welcome to the Old Guy AI podcast, brought to you by MongoDB. And now, here's Scott Sanchez and Pete Johnson.
Hello there. I'm Pete Johnson, and with me is my good friend Scott Sanchez. And Scott, before we get into the more technical AI conversation, softball, icebreaker for you. Did you ever repair an audio cassette tape with a pencil?
Yes. VHS tapes too, I think, at some point. But yeah, like sometimes you would take out the cassette and it's like it would just be all over the place and stick the eraser side in there and fiddle until you get it just snug enough and
Did
magically
you
it would
ever
work.
now? Did you ever have to do a splice? Because just like a
No,
tangle is one thing that was easier. If you had to do a splice, that was harder.
I would say like in school, in like the AV club or whatever geeky thing I was into, like yeah, we did it with VHS, but not with a cassette. Um, no, not with a cassette. That's a blast from the past. It reminds me though of like having to like blow and spit into the Nintendo cartridges
Yes,
to get those to work properly.
that was
Like it was all
that
in
was
the
a life
same
skill.
the same era. Like you knew exactly how much spit to put into the Nintendo thing to get it to work.
That's a life skill, definitely. And with the splices, you had to be careful not to. You had to have like a certain type of Scotch tape. If you had like the high glossy Scotch tape, the head inside the player would not like that. But if you got the more matte tape, that was the way to go.
So that was like that's the original sort of prompt engineering over there, right?
Yes, definitely. So let's talk about AI. So lots of things happened last week. In particular, OpenAI dropped a couple of releases. They dropped their first open source release last Tuesday, and then they dropped GPT-5 on Thursday. Which one of those do you think is most important, and why?
Certainly there was a lot more buzz around GPT-5, anticipation and then buzz and then positive and negative reaction. I do think that for adoption, the open source or open weight kind of work that they're doing has the potential to be more impactful and drive more adoption of people who are hesitant or restricted from using the public models. Um, but obviously the news cycle is all around GPT-5.
Well, I agree with you, but for a slightly different reason. Because it also marked, so they made that release on Tuesday, and then by Wednesday, both Amazon Bedrock and Google Vertex AI had it running and available for customers. So I think that it also helped them. All the things you said, I think, are 100% true, but also that it helped them establish a more formal relationship with both Google and Amazon, where previously, because of the financial relationship they have with Microsoft, they'd been exclusively Azure before. And I want to say, like, nobody knows what's exactly in that partnering agreement, right? Like, there's been some of it has been talked about publicly. Some of it has to do with like definitions of AGI and when OpenAI may or may not get there. And you see Sam Altman starting to sort of back off of what that definition is. I think longer term, if they're going to make a bigger go of it, they need to be on all three hyperscalers. And I think having the open source part of the release that gives them their first foray into a wider world beyond Azure.
I definitely agree that being everywhere that your users and your customers want across all the cloud providers is important. I do think that there's going to be for a long time an on-prem need that companies are not like regulation moves slow. And so for a lot of those reasons, I think there's a huge, I don't want to say untapped market because there are other open models out there. But I think people have been waiting for more choice there, and I think there's a good move in the right direction. Because it's not like you couldn't go to AWS or GCP and get great models already. Like like they've both all three sides of that triangle have fantastic models available, and this really is just bringing more choice to people in more places.
So if you're sitting in Meta right now and Llama has been, the King Kong or Godzilla of the open LLM market. What do you think their conversations are like after that OpenAI announcement?
If I mean, none of I wasn't surprised by the OpenAI announcement. I don't know if it caught you off guard. I would certainly hope that the smart folks over at Meta that they're paying, I don't know, like 100 to 300 million dollars a year for apparently now.
Sure, talent
I
war.
would hope, yeah. So I would hope that someone earning $100 million a year was at least anticipating, smart enough to anticipate that that they weren't going to be the only, you know, 800-pound open source gorilla in the room for long. And I don't know. I really don't think that it should have caught anyone off guard. I do think that OpenAI is going to benefit in a way that Facebook is not, Meta is not, simply because of um, all the additional learning that they're going to get from people using the hosted models, right? So when people download Llama and they use it, uh, there's not a lot of data coming back to reinforce the models.
Sure.
Whereas OpenAI, obviously, they have all their hosted models, which gets a ton of use. I think they said 700 million active users.
That was another headline. Yes.
That's a lot of data, right? So they're able to use that to improve their open models, which Llama does not benefit from in anywhere close to the same way. Obviously, they have all the Facebook data and Instagram and everything else, but it's a different use case.
And that brings up an interesting point that because OpenAI doesn't have another source of data the way some of the other big players do, and even when we saw a couple of months ago, Musk sort of recompartmentalize or reorient the companies such that the AI company now has free access to all the former Twitter data. OpenAI's got to have some way of generating more data on top of which to train. Because to your point, they don't have Facebook data, they don't have X data, they don't have like Google has, all the ad serve data that they've had for so many years. It's not only a capex, an opex, and a talent war, but it's also a data war.
Well, I'd be curious. I have a strong opinion here, but I'd be curious, how do you think that they are going to solve that problem?
Well, if you look closely at the terms and conditions of the free ChatGPT, that's one way they're going to solve it. And that's if you look very closely at the terms and conditions of, say, Gemini, the free version is not nearly as, I'll say, penalizing for the user. And that's where you get a lot of corporate data leak worries because, if I put a spreadsheet with some sensitive data in ChatGPT, I'm using the free version of it. They reserve the right to take that data and use it as training. I mean, that's the main way that they're going to try to solve it. And I wonder, I haven't looked at the terms and conditions of the open source. I wonder if they're going to try to use that part of it as well. It's a big problem for them. I mean, they have bigger problems on other fronts. The financial ones aren't easy for them to solve either because they don't have another source of revenue in the same way that Meta does, same way that Google does. Anthropic is in the same boat, but I think we've started to see, as I want to bring up here in a little bit, Anthropic started to focus the problem set that they're after in a way that so far OpenAI hasn't. So they have this broader issue to try to solve, and so far, through use of the free public tools and potentially through some of this open source, is I think the way they're going to solve it. Are you seeing another avenue?
If I were OpenAI, I would be looking, and they may be doing this. Again, they're paying people $100 million a year. I would hope people are thinking about this, across all these providers. Um, I would be looking to use pricing and feature leverage with my enterprise customers to get access to training data that is differentiated and meaningful, because the best data is the data that's inside all these corporate firewalls. the real data. Otherwise, everybody's sort of got access to a similar corpus of generally available wisdom of the crowd type of data.
All the
But
public stuff, sure.
yeah, even what's on Facebook, or what's on the web that Google has scoured. But like, at some level, everybody can kind of have access to that, or summaries of that. The data that large banks and insurance companies and pharmaceuticals and manufacturing and like all of that is that's the gold mine. And I think that um, there will be efforts by these providers like OpenAI and others to come to some kind of arrangement with their customers that are saying like, oh, well, your bill this year is going to be $300 million to use our models, but we'll knock off $100 million if you give us access to the sanitized version of this data set, right? So that we can use it for training and real-time updates and all of those things. And if they're smart, and I know we all know they're smart, I think that's a huge lever that they can provide, whether it's price discounting or feature availability or other things to help entice their large customers who have the gold mine of data to give them some kind of access to it.
The key word in your response just now, though, was sanitized. And what does that mean? And who gets to be the arbiter of who is the one that sanitizes it? And the devil's in the details of that, because if you sanitize it too much, does it no longer become that gold mine? I mean, that's where some of that stuff is going to get interesting.
I would give that a yes and. Yes, and I think that the models themselves can help value that, right? Like they're smart enough now to help that you could consume a data set, let's say with the open weight models. Like this may actually be a prompt that you could run in one of the open weight models to say, would this data set that I can give you access to because you're behind my firewall, um, what value would this have in improving what's in the public model at this point? And I think that you could get to a point where it can start to tell you what the delta there looks like and what the intrinsic value of that might be. So there are ways to go figure that out, and then even to sanitize it using the same models that you would then go improve.
Sure, it's an interesting problem, and it's one that corporate SecOps will hate.
They'll
But
hate, but you know what? Like procurement's got a tasty carrot or a weighty stick at most companies, depending on how you want to look at it. And I think if I'm a CIO or I'm someone, and it's like, well, I want to we're going to fundamentally change our business with these new technologies, but my budget doesn't allow it. How can I barter? What do I have to barter with? you know, as long as I'm not exposing customer secrets or real trade secrets or something, like I think it should all be on the table. Because if I don't give it to them, my competitor is going to give it to them, and they're going to save $100 million a year. Uh, and wouldn't I rather do that? Right. So I
so
think there's going to be really interesting conversations at the board level at a lot of companies about you know wh- how how do we want to value our data in the age of AI, and what is that worth and to who?
so then by extension, being an expert at sanitizing data becomes a far more viable skill than it was before, right? Because if that opens the door, just given, I just spent 4.5 years as a field CTO in a very large sales organization. And, the security folks are just, they've got this, they've got the bejesus scared out of them, out of what the security implications of this are. And if you're talking about you're talking about handing over data that was otherwise seen as inside the firewall and therefore, completely secure. I see your point that it becomes a bargaining chip, and I think it's definitely where that's going. But it
Yeah,
implies that
look,
you have some skill in figuring out what's just enough to give them without giving away the store.
I'll say a few things. and then I know you have a list of topics, so I'll let you move on. But like I said, I have strong opinions about this. I think number one, that this is a decision that companies are going to need to make themselves, and it probably is like up to a C-suite and board level conversation. Um, it likely will almost exclusively not include customer data, right? So like put that aside. I think that there are a lot of, I go to like the pharmaceutical example, or you can go to financial services around transaction types and volumes and industries. Like there's just so much deep, sort of very verticalized data that is not in the public or licensable domain today.
Fair.
Healthcare. Like just think how much better uh ChatGPT could be, or Gemini could be 2 years from now, if multiple major research and insurance companies gave them access to how treatments actually work and proceed. And they're not just looking at medical journals now, they're looking at like a ton, like hundreds of millions of people worth of data, right? Without the people's data. And so to your point, yes, sanitizing this stuff becomes important, but I think it's more about the trends and the outcomes that the models can learn from than any like individual person's data. And it will be a very, very important and individualized conversation that companies need to have, because it's not up to the vendors or the cloud providers or anyone else to like make these decisions for their customers. And anyone that does, I think when we start seeing that in terms of service, I'm going to put them on my do not use list. And like it's just shouldn't be, the default should not be we'll train with your data. And I think a lot of the tools and things now, like the default is you go in and you look at it and it's like, it's toggled on that we will train with your data. And like people need to probably start turning that off, and know that your data is valuable, whether you're a person or a company or a nation state, um, and figure out what that's worth to you.
That reminds me very much of like how every 6 months in the early days, the Facebook terms and conditions would change and you'd have to go into the settings
Still,
and, what is it you do or don't want to give up. And I agree. We're probably headed to somewhere similar. And if you do it at corporate layer, that just puts another level of complexity. There's definitely money in it. But speaking of money, if we can go to a different topic, you mentioned that one of the other announcements that was made recently regarding OpenAI was the announcement they reached 12 billion in annual recurring revenue and the 700 million users that you mentioned. I want to pull up a diagram that I found that somebody on X created. I want to talk you through it and get your reaction to it. You see that?
I can see that.
So for those on audio only, this came from an X user named Peter Gostev, who works over at theinformation.com, and it was their teaser of some AI market analysis that they've done. There's 4 groups of vertical bars. At the top, the diagram is labeled with OpenAI's 12 billion is far ahead of Anthropic's 5 billion ARR for 2025. But then the subheading is, but Anthropic is beating it in the API business with 1.4 billion alone coming from Cursor and GitHub. So the 4 sort of categories is there's consumer subscriptions, and there's a blue bar for OpenAI and an orange bar for Anthropic. In that category, it shows OpenAI with 5.5 billion in revenue, Anthropic with 0.7 billion. In the business and partner, it shows OpenAI with 3.6 billion, Anthropic with 0.9 billion. In API revenue, it's got Anthropic at 3.1 billion and OpenAI at 2.9. But then there's sort of a sub designation that shows that of that 3.1 billion, Cursor and GitHub Copilot are 1.4 billion of that. And then the final one is code specific product. And OpenAI does not have one. And of course, Claude Code, which I'm a big fan of, is one of Anthropic's flagship products. And it's got about $400 million out of Claude Code so far. So I thought this was an interesting breakdown of how the revenue is working out. And I teased a minute ago this sort of focus that Anthropic has had on code. This diagram certainly shows that. Scott, what are your reactions to this kind of reporting and this level of detail?
The reporting, the information never disappoints. Long time subscriber for a lot of reasons. The thing that stands out for me here is where's the margin? So it's great to have 700 million users. It's an incredible feat. But when you look at the consumer side of this, I really do wonder what the margin profile looks like on that, given like how heavily a lot of people are using their $20 a month subscription. On the business and partner side, you need a pretty big, there's a pretty big cost basis for winning that kind of business, right? You need enterprise sales reps, you need solution consultants, you need support, you need all that other stuff. And so again, margin. And then you get to the API revenue, which I think for them, at least, half of, a lot of is their integrations with a couple of these vibe coding and coding assistant products.
Sure, yeah.
I would guess that the margin on their API revenue is like 10x what the margin is on the consumer subscription. And so while they might be Anthropic might be way behind on the revenue on consumer subscription, I have a feeling they might be making the same amount of money when you factor in all the cost and the infrastructure cost of providing $5 billion worth of consumer subscriptions, or $9 billion between the business and the consumer stuff for OpenAI. And so that's what really jumps out to me is like, yes, they're making OpenAI way more money. OpenAI is making way more money, but is Anthropic actually onto a more profitable business model? And that's, I don't think we have that data, but when I see a chart like this, that's really what I think of.
Well, the thing that it reminds me of, I mean, when you and I first met in about 2012, there was that Cloud Beers group of analysts that would, so named because you put the Cloud Beers hashtag in Twitter to say, what bar we were going to go hang out at the end of the day of whatever conference we were all at, and have a bunch of these sort of off the record conversations about the state of the cloud market as it was, 13 years ago or so. And back then, the hyperscalers weren't releasing much detailed data about their businesses either. So it reminds me of that there's a lot of guessing from the outside looking in, because, they're privately held companies. They're under no obligation to give us the kind of detail that you're speculating. But I think your speculation, having gone through that with the cloud already, I would agree with. Certainly cost of goods sold when it comes to either the business or the consumer is much higher for the reasons you laid out than going after the developer set, where that API revenue, you got it documented. You go out and entice people to use it. Maybe you do a little bit of developer relations. And with Claude Code, it sometimes is even easier. That Anthropic has pivoted and been so focused on the developer community reminds me of, but our audience probably doesn't. I did 20 years at HP, and there was this old school HP concept called Next Bench. And the idea of Next Bench was like in the early days of HP, when like Bill Hewlett was personally designing most of the products, the people that were designing these products for, oscilloscopes and, the kinds of tools that an electrical engineer was going to need, the product that, one person might be designing was in effect for the target audience was the engineer working at the next bench over. So this Anthropic focus on developers reminds me of that. I mean, there's a hefty amount of software engineering that goes into all these AI tools, and now Anthropic is making that the first major audience that they're going after. Pivoting maybe a little bit, they've started to announce, but I haven't played with some of the financial services tools. But I think it's pretty smart of them to focus on particular audiences because they don't have as much financial backing, at least right now, as OpenAI. So it's harder for them to compete for the broader, for the broader audience. And number two, as you just brought up, it just so happens that this audience of developers, you can sort of get their favor at a lower cost of goods sold than some of the other options. So I read it the exact same way. And like I said, it reminds me a little bit of that old school HP stuff with the electrical engineering. And it certainly reminds me of cloud when we were early days of cloud and we were guessing at who was making what and where the GP might be coming from.
Yeah, there's also the breadth versus depth kind of conversation, where you can start to think about, is OpenAI trying to be the everything store, to use that in that framing, where they've got a ton of different models and a ton of different capabilities and use cases, and they're generally great at everything, but they're not exceptional at any one thing. And it seems like Anthropic is kind of going the other way, where they're trying to stay pretty narrow, but go really deep. And to your point, build that reputation for being exceptional at these coding type use cases and things that developers are going to really embrace. And maybe financial services and maybe healthcare and maybe other things down the road. But I do think either the persona alignment or the industry vertical alignment is going to be where a lot of the margin comes from, instead of just trying to be a general purpose, good at everything. The training and infrastructure costs on that are high. The go-to-market costs on that are high. The competition is going to be high, and I think it's going to be a race to the bottom as good enough quickly. Like, every model is quickly going to be good enough at the current pace, and then it's really going to come down to sort of the spoils will be made at the fringes.
Right. And I think early on there was this assumption that, just like there was with AWS, that like there'll be one product to rule them all and they'll rule all verticals and all use cases. When the truth is there's lots of nuance as to why you might choose a cloud provider and why you might choose an LLM. And verticalization is certainly one of them. While you were talking, I looked up just so I could state it out loud. So OpenAI's got about 57.9 billion in across 11 funding rounds. Anthropic to date 14 billion across 13 funding rounds. Now that 57.9 sounds like a lot, but when you look at how much Meta is throwing into data centers, and they're not doing it by borrowing money, or at least they don't have to, right? They've got that much cash on hand that they can spend on that kind of thing. So there's this, OpenAI is kind of fighting off Anthropic as the little guy for one part of this, and they're fighting off, the other big players as well at the same time. It makes you wonder if like Anthropic has, are they going to have to pick at some point?
Yeah, I do like the Anthropic go-to-market approach of really trying to build affinity with the developers. We've seen time and time again that developer preference tends to last. Like, it's a hard thing to overcome later. You have to be so much better than what they're currently using for them to want to switch and want to sort of replumb and take on the technical challenges of learning the new platforms. And I think they're onto something, because even if it gets to the point where the Anthropic models are not state of the art for a particular use case, all the developers that have spent all this time to really, really deeply understand it and how it works and how to plumb it into their apps are probably just going to keep using it, even when it's not going to be the best for their use case. As long as it doesn't get to the point where it's 5 times more expensive, because that will start to show up in how people vote with their code, right?
Well, in that way, it's almost like the old Apple education grant program.
Mm-hmm.
Like the first computer I ever touched was an Apple II I was 8 years old in 1978. And my mom worked at what was then like a tutoring service. They called it Learning Assistance Center in, in a large junior college in Southern California. And through a grant, she got an Apple II and they didn't know what to do with it. So she stuck it in the storage closet behind her desk. And once a week over the summer, she'd bring me in and say, hey, play with this. And for the people that then ended up using the next summer, there was a lab of 12 of them. And then the next summer there was 24 of them. And then the summer after that, there was 50. And some people, to your point, once you start to use one, you get some brand affinity for what you used first. That could be a longer term ramification of what we're seeing Anthropic do. I've got one more related diagram I want to throw at you here. So let's look at. It now seems like it's old. We're recording this on August 11th, and there was a study here published by Menlo Ventures on July 31st. And keep in mind that Menlo Ventures is a pretty heavy investor in Anthropic. But what they did was they conducted a survey across enterprises and startups. And if I enlarge this diagram for you, Scott, and then I'll describe it. So there's two diagrams here. There's a line chart on the left-hand side showing market share, API LLM market share in 2023, 24, and mid-25. That's what the line on the left-hand side is. And there's 4 vendors listed: Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, and Meta. And in 2023, OpenAI had 50% of that LLM API market share. Meta had 16%, Anthropic just 12%, and Google 7%. And as it has progressed, both Anthropic and Google have risen at the cost of OpenAI and Meta having fallen. So the mid 2025 numbers that Menlo Ventures is publishing is 32% of the LLM API market share for Anthropic, 25% for OpenAI, 20% for Google, and 9% now for Meta. And on the right-hand side, there is a coding market share pie graph that shows Anthropic with 42% of the coding market share, which follows nicely from that diagram that we were just talking through, given both the Claude Code revenue that Anthropic is seeing and the revenue that they're seeing from interactions with both Cursor and GitHub agents. So Scott, I guess my first question for you then is like, how valid do you think that the data is, given, how heavily invested Menlo Ventures might be in the answer? And then second, does this rise of API usage for Anthropic surprise you, given the conversation we just had about the emphasis on the developer?
I'll start by saying that the folks at Menlo Ventures, I would guess that they did everything in their power to make this survey as unbiased as possible, but they did focus on the one part of the market that Anthropic is really, really good at. And so I don't think that it surprises me to see this, but I do think that you're talking about Anthropic, seemingly coming out of nowhere, and they kind of did, right? Like they got a later start at a lot of this, which is why 2 years ago they had 12 and now they have 32. But the size of the market has 50x or whatever in that time. So yes, OpenAI went from 50 to 25 if you believe the numbers here, but the revenue has gone up and to the right, as a benefactor of just how big the market has continued to grow. So I don't know. I do think that when I look at a chart like this, one of the things that I worry about is if any one company gets too big of a market share in I'll say the coding space, are all the apps going to sort of start to feel and look the same? Like, do we risk innovation just sort of like all feeling homogenized because developers stop thinking for themselves and the LLMs are writing it all and everyone's using the same LLM, and it'd be like having the same developer build every app for every company is kind of like the risk that we face here. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how some of the obviously developer skill sets and imagination vary widely amongst humans, but it'll be interesting to see as folks start to combine some of these the way they're doing either with arbitrage or something else, to have them comparing approaches across the models, even at additional cost, to make sure that they're actually building something that's differentiated and everyone's not building the same exact thing with the same exact code generator.
Well, my reaction to that is, so I get where you're coming from, that if this spike to, right now it's showing coding market share for Anthropic at 42%. What if that went to 80? So does that mean that every application or almost every application is getting written by Claude Code, or at the end, by the LLMs that are in the back end? And does that run the risk of limiting the creativity of those applications? And I guess what I would say is, does the creativity then shift to the prompter and not to the implementer? Because the way most of these... No, go ahead.
Yes, the creativity is in the eye of the prompter, but I'm going to get that on a t-shirt. But I think that the challenge with a lot of these tools is that, yeah, if you're using a vibe coding thing and you can sort of tell it, code me up a user interface for this, or give me that. Yes, it's prompt driven, but it's still fairly constrained. And I think a lot of the other side of this is like when you're using it in an IDE, when you're actually using it sort of in line, you don't get as much prompting capability. It's starting to just become more intuitive, and it starts sort of filling. It's like autofill. It just starts to fill it in for you. And that's where I start to worry that like the things it starts to plug in are going to feel very similar, unless there's a quantum leap from where we are and how these things operate from a code generation perspective.
Okay. Well, like I said, I think like a lot of things, this shifts the creativity and a whole bunch of the other things to the prompter and away from the implementer. That comes with its own challenges, and I'll definitely take one of those t-shirts. Let me stop sharing here and let's wrap up.
One thing to add on that, just to use an analogy, is like if we were using one of these models to come up with a menu in our restaurant, and we're like, hey, I have these ingredients. I want to cook up some Italian food. Come up with my menu for me. Give me the recipes. Give me all of that. Like if 10 people asked the same model the same kinds of questions, you'd end up with 10 restaurants that are kind of serving the same food. And yes, the prompter can be like, well, no, I mean Northern Italian, and no, I like it olive oil more, and I don't like basil, don't put that in there. So like, yes, sure, you can really start to tweak it, but that's going to take an expert chef who really knows all of that to go do that. And not every chef is an expert. Not every developer is world class. There are a lot of just very average developers. They're very good at what they do, but they're not exceptional, and some of them don't care to be. And I think that's the risk that we run if we get too overweight as an industry on any one model, is that we're all going to be eating the same Italian food, which is delicious, but isn't really differentiated. And I think that's a risk that we run.
Well, let's leave it there for this session. And thanks so much for the time, Scott. Until next time, make sure you keep that pencil near your audio cassettes.
Thank you, Pete.
This has been the Old Guy AI podcast. Views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the sponsors or the employers of any hosts or guests.